Okay, we are recording. So good luck, everybody. Be fun. And again, I'll keep an eye on the time and make sure. And again, forgive me in advance if I pop in and interrupt you if you go over, if I'm looking a little bit long. All right. Okay, here we go. That's there, popping in. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. Hi, Charles. Hi, Michael. Michael Lesk, Alex. Goodness, all these old friends. People I haven't seen in a long time. All right.
I'm glad you said old friends, Connie, and not old something else.
Well, let's not get started with the old thing. All right. Again, so welcome everyone to Colloquium. This is our first Colloquium of the session. My name is Connie Pascal, and it is my pleasure to both host these Colloquium events as well as be the instructor for the Colloquium class. We're delighted to have this faculty panel on tonight. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here a little bit. Here is our agenda for the evening, sorry, we usually have these in the evening, for the afternoon. Again, going to do a little bit of welcome and introduction. I'm going to run a quick little over, again, our agenda. Caitlin Costello is going to frame our event, and then we'll have panel opening remarks from our panelists, and then a panel discussion. We'll be monitoring your questions in the chat, so go ahead and put those in at any point in time. We'll have just a small amount of time for Q&A, and then our panelists have graciously agreed to stay for a few minutes after the official part of the colloquium is over to do a more informal Q&A. All right. So, hold on. I'm sorry. I'm having a sharing problem here. You are seeing my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But we're seeing it in the
right.
different view than usual.
All right. Sorry. Let's just real quickly, for purpose of the video, my apologies. We're going to go ahead and start over and tell me when you can actually see my screen. You should see the full screen now.
We can see it, but it's not the full screen.
It's not the full screen.
Presenter view. Well, the thumbnail view.
Oh well. All right. Tell you what. Let's, in the interest of time, we're going to just stop that completely. And I'm going to start over, and I'm going to just start by welcoming Marie Radford. So one more time, here we go. So good afternoon. My name is Connie Pascal. This is MI Colloquium. We are pleased to welcome you today to our first MI Colloquium of the event. And I'd like to start out by introducing Marie Radford. Marie is the chair of the LIS department, and she's going to kick us off. Take it away, Marie.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is my deep pleasure to welcome you to this MI Colloquium. Our topic today, algorithms in healthcare, is a critically important topic, one that impacts every single one of us, probably almost every single day, right? And so today we have 4 panelists with us. All of them are faculty in our LIS department: Caitlin Costello, Vivek Singh, Tafik Amari, and Charles Centio. So I'm going to allow them all to start talking, and I'll be quiet. Well, looking forward to your talks.
All right, thank you, Marie, and thank you, Connie, and thanks to all the panelists for being here. We've got a really good lineup, and I'm really excited for our discussion. This is a great opportunity for us and for everybody. So thank you to everyone for generously giving their time for this event. So I thought that what might be useful just quickly before we get into introductions is to kind of set the stage and give us all some definitions that we're all kind of working from. And then I think, we'll go in. I know we all prepared a little kind of 5-minute spiel about our research and stuff. So maybe after I give these definitions, we'll just go in alphabetical order and talk about our work, and then we'll dive in. We've got a bunch of questions to get into for discussion. So let's see. I will also put these definitions in the chat, but I wanted to start out by defining health. So health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So it's not just the absence of disease, right? It's also being able to flourish and do well, right? So it's this, and it's not just physical, right? It also encompasses mental and social well-being. Kind of stemming from that, the idea of healthcare is the maintenance or improvement of health via prevention, diagnosis, treatment, recovery, or cure of health conditions. And healthcare algorithms are typically used throughout medicine. They have all kinds of different functions. And I think the ones that we'll mostly be talking about in discussion today are things like determining prognosis and risk, and predictive algorithms for diagnosis and for treatment decision-making. And then finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about algorithmic bias today. And so to make sure we're all on the same page definitionally, algorithmic biases are systematic and repeatable errors in algorithmic systems that create inequitable outcomes for different sectors of the society. So now that we kind of have our general frame and our general definitions, I'm going to turn it over to Tawfiq to introduce himself, and then you'll hear from me again briefly, and then we'll hear from, I'm doing the alphabetical order in my head here, Charles, and then Vivek. All right, so take it away, Tawfiq.
Okay, so hi, my name is Tawfiq Amari. I'm assistant professor at the in the LIS department. My research looks at the interaction between technology and social change. So as technology changes, how that affects the way that we think about them ourselves, and how we discuss ourselves and our identities online. Should I go into the spiel about AI now, or should we continue with introductions first?
I kind of, since Marie kind of gave everyone our names, I was thinking that we could kind of give our opening remarks now.
Excellent. So in my work, I think about the way that I think about technology usually is kind of following in the footsteps of Kentaro Toyama, who basically thinks of technology as an amplifier. So technology is, he wrote a book called Geek Heresy that basically says that technology is not necessarily a panacea to problems, because part of the problem is that it amplifies whatever current socioeconomic, racial, structural racism, other gender differences, other biases that are already there. And so when we look at how our technologies affect the way that our systems work or don't work, one of the ways we have to build our metrics is around how they amplify problems that are already existing. So let me just give a quick example. One classifier or algorithm that was built by there's a paper about that by Ziad Obermeyer out of UC Berkeley. They basically audited this algorithm used by a healthcare company to predict whether patients would require extra medical care. And basically this algorithm bumped up medical care for white patients. Now, mind you, there is no, in the algorithm, the way that it was trained, the way it was built, the race was not a factor, right? It was not one of the variables where the features used in training the algorithm. But prior healthcare costs were. They were used as a proxy to say whether or not, if you had a higher healthcare cost in the past, then you probably need more. That's the argument, right? But they didn't take into account that usually people who have more access to healthcare happen to be white and more privileged, and so the system basically reproduced this economic inequality in the outcome, which usually again bumped up white patients. And this is not necessarily only in the healthcare. Like, this doesn't only show up in algorithms used in the healthcare industry. This is basically a problem that arises when you use AI or machine learning generally, right? Because the quality of the output, the quality of the classification basically is linked to the quality of the data set that is used and how biased it is. So there are many other examples that come up with, for example, the Amazon algorithm that was classifying CVs to look for the best applicants, right? And one of the things that happened is that that classifier was penalizing words like women's chess club. So women's was actually penalizing the score for applicants. Again, this is not something that is input per se consciously, but the system doesn't, you know, those folks who designed the system don't take into account structural problems that already are around in, you know, are available in society. So just to give you an example of how these are available, there are algorithms that build what we call embeddings. Embeddings are representations of language that allow you to see semantic relationships, so context, right? And one of the things that they try to do is train these embeddings over a lot of text. And because they are not changing any of this text, the bias is there. And they wanted to see how biased the language can be. So they would try to see what are the closest words associated with the word engineer when it comes to jobs, like what jobs come, and women. With women, the closest words were dancer, housekeeper, librarian, nurse, and secretary. For men, it was engineer, carpenter, mechanic, that sort of thing. So again, we see that like the biases that are already out there in the way that society is structured are kind of reproduced by these algorithms, reproduced by in the systems that they are built on. So questions that, so, you know, systems that might include something that you wouldn't think about as you know, biasing, something like a zip code might be very biasing depending on the outcomes for people living in particular zip codes. Same that goes with language. And so I'm going to end with saying like this is biases in these systems are kind of built in because most of our data sets are actually biased. One of the things we can do is introduce more audits to these systems as they're being produced, continuous audits, and having more domain experts work with the designers of these algorithms to make sure that the outcomes are not biased in a way that might not be clear to someone who's not well versed in the domain. So we'll just circle back to the algorithm that provided more healthcare to white patients. Anyone who is in the maybe public health area could have told them that this proxy doesn't work because of the current inequalities in the healthcare system. And now I'm done.
Right. Thank you so much, Tawfiq. I'll just give a really brief spiel about my research, and then we'll move to Charles. I'm an assistant professor here at Sky. I think all of us are Vivek's associate professor, and I study health information practice. And so my recent project in this space is an ongoing qualitative study about the use of mobile tracking technologies and machine learning to infer or predict someone's mental health status, which is also called digital phenotyping. And so the idea behind digital phenotyping is that mental health issues are common worldwide, but they're pretty difficult to diagnose and treat. And part of that is because of stigma, marginalization, and access difficulties. So there's this idea that we can use either manual mood tracker apps or digital phenotyping, which basically takes your trace data from your phone and uses a predictive model, right, to decide whether or not, right, or to predict whether or not you are experiencing a mental health issue or a mental health crisis, right? And these things have been touted as these kind of innovative strategies for tackling the mental health problem that's worldwide. But existing research on mood tracking doesn't usually involve people who use these apps outside of a clinical setting. So in this particular study, what we did is we've currently conducted 20 semi-structured interviews with participants who use manual mood tracking and who have been diagnosed with at least one mental health condition to try to figure out, right, like how they feel about healthcare providers having access to this data and how they feel about having their mood tracking not be manual, but be automated. And so the objective of this work is to really center the perspectives of people who actually, right, would be impacted by these technologies. And so to kind of dig deeper into digital phenotyping really quickly, this isn't a hypothetical, right? So algorithmically inferring someone's mental health status using their trace data from their phones or like social media data, right, is not hypothetical. There's a lot of interest from both the commercial sector and government agencies in using these kinds of algorithms and machine learning to infer people's, right, mental health status. And Facebook actually does this. They monitor for suicide risk, and they've initiated over 1,000 wellness checks with police in response to these kind of proactive reports on their platform. And so if we know, right, at least in the United States, people with mental illnesses are 16 times more likely to be killed during police encounters, we're working with a really vulnerable population on which to conduct digital phenotyping. And so this work kind of pushes at some of these questions about how we define risk and how we define risk assessment. And I guess before I hand it off, I want to say that one of the big kind of findings was that our participants felt really fatalistic about this. My favorite quote was one of our participants said, "It's really bold of us to assume this isn't already happening," right? And so thinking about, right, risk and risk assessment and how these things are defined, I'm hoping we can dig into that in discussion a little more. And now I'll turn it over to Charles.
Thank you, Caitlin, and wonderful to be here with you all this afternoon. My name is Charles Centio. I am a community health informaticist. So I also focus on health equity. So what I do is I think about and study information access and exchange in the context of health behavior and chronic disease. So I work on both the patient or community side as well as the provider side. So I've done work with EHRs and their collection of information and use of information like financial barriers to accessing care, to the patient side and how they have access to information about, for example, treatment outcomes, which I'll talk about in a second. I also do community-based work. So not with every project, but with the majority of my projects, I work closely with community contacts and community organizations to not just recruit participants, but actually help design studies and chime in and provide input into research questions all the way through dissemination. So that's an approach that I use in my work. As far as my current things that are occupying me quite a bit in terms of my research, I'm working on treatment decision-making, supporting treatment decision-making for men who have been diagnosed with prostate cancer and who have not yet picked a treatment. So this is kind of a classic treatment decision aid, which will be technology enabled. We'll take a current decision aid. This is what I'm proposing to do. Take a current decision aid and work with Black men to help them come up with a treatment decision that is appropriate for them. One of the vexing things about prostate cancer treatment decisions is that for low-grade prostate cancer, let's just say low-risk prostate cancer that hasn't metastasized, that hasn't advanced, there are various treatment options. And for the most part, the treatment options result in similar mortality outcomes. So the issue really is about side effects. And these treatment options come with pretty wide differences in side effects. And to get at which treatment option is best for the particular patient or individual, we must understand their preferences. And Black men in particular prefer a shared decision-making. However, in practice, shared decision-making doesn't happen in the clinical consultations. So what I'm attempting to do is try to figure out how to support shared decision-making by providing information in a way that's culturally appropriate so that these men can engage more with their oncologists and with their surgeons as they discuss their preferences and discuss what treatment options might be best for them. Now, what does this have to do with AI? Well, and I'll get to that in a moment when I talk about the issues that I think confront anyone who's focused on healthcare and wellness is that you have underrepresentation in clinical trials for cancer drugs specifically. And what that does is it skews kind of what Tawfiq kind of alluded to this as well. It makes for your data to not be representative of the people that the results are purporting to sort of affect. And that's a huge issue, and it's a long-standing issue. Before I get into that, though, let me talk about my other project. We can't go too far without mentioning COVID, especially from an equity researcher. So one of the projects that I guess I started around April was to look at intragroup differences or examine intragroup differences when it comes to vaccine hesitation. So one of the things that has irked me about equity research is that too often we view racial categories as a monolith. And I know this because I not only in my work, but in my personal life, not all Black and not all brown people are the same and feel the same way about certain things. So I decided that we should measure intragroup differences. Let's look at scales that measure differences within ethnic groups and see which factors may affect someone's vaccine hesitancy or intent to get vaccinated. We've done a lot of preliminary analysis, and we've narrowed this down to now exclusively African Americans. We didn't see a lot of difference within the Latinx acculturation scales that we were using. So what we're doing is focusing in on African Americans and what's called an African American acculturation scale, a validated measure, and looking at which factors may influence a person's vaccine hesitancy. Factors like religion and faith, factors like exposure to segregation and discrimination, those kinds of things. So we've gotten some preliminary data. I won't report it here quite yet, but very soon we should be publishing our results. Those are so in terms of the issues with the topic sort of at hand here, I want to talk a little bit about lack of reporting and representation in clinical trials, as I alluded to earlier. And then the second topic that I want to just surface here is that we scientists are under the illusion that science is objective and bias-free, which is entirely not the case. So in terms of reporting and representation, as some of you may know, there has been a long-standing issue with lack of racial equitable reporting and representation in clinical trials. And this has been the case long before COVID became part of our vocabulary and our existence. So, and I'm happy to provide sources in the chat or however we want to share that. But just in reporting alone, let's take reporting for a second. The headline here is that too many clinical trials don't even report race in their populations. So one recent study, it was in JAMA 2018, looked at 230 clinical trials for cancer drugs and found that in 62% of them, they did report on the white population in the trials. 47.8, about 50% reported Asian population in trials. 38% reported Black, 10% reported Hispanic. So that's just reporting that there are Hispanic, Black, Asian in the clinical trial. It just mention race at all. And that gives you an example of, I think, how stark the condition is in terms of trying to create representative data that represents the population. And there's been a long-standing issue. If you go to PubMed, you'll see papers 25 years ago that are describing the lack of representation in clinical trials. And we see that, again, for cancer drugs, again, 230 trials, Blacks represented 3.1 participants in clinical trials. Hispanics represent 6.1% of participants. And that just shows you kind of the scale of underrepresentation that exists. And again, these are for cancer drugs. So these are cancer drugs being developed and that are being used that have let's just say that have representation that does not reflect the population. So when I think about AI bias, I think first about reporting, like, do we even report the populations used to come up with our findings? And then if we do, what's the representation? The second point I think we can more widely discuss if we like, depending on the appetite of the audience here, is that I think that sometimes we are under the delusion that science is objective. And I'll just introduce a little bit of my social worker background in here to say that bias is not bad or a negative thing on its own, but it can have negative effects. And in order to mitigate the negative effects of bias, we first have to recognize that we have bias. And I think that as scientists, we would all do ourselves and each other in this peer review environment well to just recognize that our science is not completely objective and that science is conducted by people and it's subject to the same biases that people have, much like our algorithms are. So as I conclude here, I'll share with you a comment that I had an exchange on Twitter about yet another study that showed that there was algorithmic bias in picking people for jobs. We see that example quite a bit where there's bias there. And I commented that there the machines go acting like people again. And that's something that I think that we should all keep top of mind.
All right, thanks so much, Charles. I see some good connections here. Let's hear from Vivek.
All right, thank you, everyone. Also, thank you to Tawfiq, Charles, Caitlin. They introduced the topic quite well. In terms of my work, I am a human-centered data scientist, so I tend to build AI algorithms for human-relevant tasks, things like cyberbullying detection, things like mental health assessment, the kind of things Caitlin was talking about earlier. And then the second thing is we want to make sure that these things are responding to human needs, right? So issues like privacy or issues like algorithmic fairness are important when we are building these kinds of algorithms. So I'll point out to a couple of efforts that we've tried in this space. Each of these, we have some initial results, some early papers, but they are all ongoing projects. So the first one, we tried to study this problem of trying to detect mental health assessment. Again, these are only triaging. So very basic understanding if everything is going well in somebody's life, or there are some things which would require a closer look by a doctor or a nurse. So we did do that work. We presented some initial results on that. And then we went back at that and we tried to look, hey, okay, this was on the whole 80% accurate, but was it performing equally well for different sections of the society? Again, as a starting point, what we are looking at is gender, specifically binary gender, and I must acknowledge the limitations with that. But we wanted to see if there are equitable performances from the algorithm in terms of these genders. And we found that there were significant differences. And then we went inside the algorithm, like to the nitty-gritties of the algorithm, what kind of processes are part of that algorithm. And what we tried to do was try to normalize the raw features which are making up the algorithm so that they become more equitable for the different groups that we were considering. And what we have found is that this process, like changing things under the hood, kind of allows you to get more equitable results in the scenario that we are considering. This is something that we are also trying to do now in collaboration with like a mental health expert, somebody who's a professor of psychiatry. So they can bring in their advice onto what kinds of things we should be looking at and what kind of things we shouldn't touch. And like they are outside the scope of what things we can the knobs that we can turn in that process and so on. So that's one example. Another one that we are trying to do is, again, we heard the word COVID again, who hasn't, right? So in terms of COVID information dissemination, what we tried to look at was how algorithms, or specifically the search autocomplete algorithms, work differently across different languages. So if you just type on Google coronavirus it kind of gives you some autocompletes. It would be things like coronavirus is bad, coronavirus is a hoax, coronavirus is man-made, coronavirus is gone, whatever it is, but it will give you a bunch of autocompletes. And you will get this also in the Spanish equivalent, like basically you change the interface and you will get coronavirus S, and then you'll get a bunch of autocompletes. Again, we are working with somebody who's a professor of public health and who also happens to speak Spanish in a native manner. So what we tried to do was look at these autocompletes in English and in Spanish, and we tried to compare a number of things. How many options are there? What is the sentiment conveyed? What kind of topics are being covered in the autocompletes that we are seeing? And again, we have some preliminary results on that. What we found was in Spanish, there was a lesser number of options. The overall sentiment tended to be more negative, and the topics covered are relatively different. For instance, in the Spanish, we found more instances of religion or spirituality in the autocompletes compared to the English version. And this is again a problematic or an issue that we should focus on, because we saw for things like hand sanitizer, the overall sentiment was kind of neutral, sometimes even positive in English, but it was much more negative in Spanish. So now if two sections of the society, they look at these results and they create different mental models of whether to use or not to use things like hand sanitizers, this could mean different behaviors, different downstream health outcomes, and so on. And again, mind you, these were all being done at the same location in the incognito mode and so on. So again, the health risks are the same. All we changed was the search interface, and we are getting very different search outcomes. So again, these were like the two threads that I wanted to highlight of the kind of work my students and I have been working on.
All right, thank you, Vivek. So as you can see, we have a really lovely, right, cross-section of people doing all kinds of different work related to algorithms, bias, and healthcare, which makes for a really interesting panel discussion, I think. One of the things that I kept thinking as we were talking and as I was listening to everybody is this idea of, right, the role of the scientist. I think Charles brought this up really nicely, right, and the role of the measurer when we measure. And so thinking about, right, whether or not science is objective, right, and whether or not bias is, like, I also like, right, the idea, right, that bias isn't necessarily inherently bad, right, but like Vivek was talking about, we can look, right, and figure out where maybe it is doing what Tawfiq was saying, right, and amplifying, right, social problems. So I thought that we could spend our short discussion time kind of, this is going so fast and it's so fascinating. I thought that we could kind of discuss a few questions that I have. So I thought we could maybe start by first talking a little bit about what benefits we think AI can bring to healthcare. Like, what do we think are the big positive changes that we think algorithms and AI will bring to the healthcare sector? What do we think?
Okay, I'll start. So I think many of the benefits would be the same as what we have seen from AI in general. So things like automation, right? You can get things done, and you can get things done at scale. You can get things done via a human or well, in this case, a robot or a computer who doesn't forget. Also, they can do things like processing things at gigaflops, which again, we human beings have limited powers. Again, I guess we will go into some of the limitations in the next couple of prompts. But again, things like automatically looking at chest x-rays and inferring whether somebody has COVID or not, or even trying to go through all the permutations and combinations it takes for vaccine identification. These are the kind of predict early symptom tracking and figuring out whose symptoms are going to get worse or who needs the intervention now rather than waiting for 3 days. Those are the things where AI can and has been showing signs of remarkable progress. Again, with the caveat, we'll be discussing some of the limitations soon.
Yeah, definitely. So highlighting, right, this, the diagnostic power, I think especially, right, being able to maybe see things that human eyes can't see, right, in an X-ray scan. Charles, Tawfiq, do you have things you want to add? I know Charles works specifically in thinking about diagnostics and in treatment decision making.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to paint a picture that it's all bad. I mean, these in terms of picking a more personalized treatment regimens, the potential is great, and I do support that certainly. It's just that, you know, like we all should do, we ask questions about, well, how are these recommendations, how are they arrived at, and what data was used and analysis was used to get there. But yeah, there's huge potential in sort of targeting communities or targeting certain diseases that might be more prevalent in certain communities. I know there's a wonderful corpus of literature around that, as well as, you know, which treatments are effective. There are still very open questions. I know I've talked about prostate cancer, but in terms of which treatment is right for which individual, that's just still quite an open question for many.
I think there are kind of two ways where we can see some advantages of AI that can be used. One of them is kind of piggybacking of what Vivek just said, actually using the biases that are out there in language to kind of figure out what problems people might have when they're not included in surveys as much, undersampled in surveys or other work. Just as Charles said, that's one that is kind of on the periphery of healthcare, but more about like if we don't have those data coming through, you know, health organizations, there's other ways of finding them: social media, search online, that sort of thing. I think the other one is, as you know, the examples that came up are very well defined, right? The parameters are defined. It's an X-ray. We have they're labeled by doctors, and you know, we were create a model that kind of predicts them further. It allows us to do things quicker, again, amplifying, but in this way, in a way that actually helps more people. So I think the problem kind of starts seeping in when you bring more of the human, impact into the algorithms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that we generally live in an environment that's very techno-solutionist, right? So the idea that we can use technology to solve any kind of problems that we have is, I think, kind of often a go-to, which is kind of an interesting way, I think, to think about these things. But I think Tawfiq kind of hinted at this a little bit, and this leads really nicely into my next question for us, which is, what are some of the main risks of algorithmic bias in healthcare applications? Don't all jump at once. I know I have a lot of ideas here, but I want to give some space.
I'll give a quick, I'll just kind of link it to what I said earlier. I think again, it all boils down to like what you're trying to amplify. And the danger here is that some things that are taken for granted because unbiased scientific research has shown them to be true, right? Unbiased scientific are kind of going to be amplified in the way that we implement the system. So like I said before, I think one of the main ones that is, to my mind, kind of damaging is where resources are kind of thrown at in the healthcare system, right? If you're saying there's more resources needed for these people, not these people, without understanding what kind of dynamics came up, provided you with that answer, then we run the risk of providing resources where they are less needed and taking out resources from where they're severely needed. And that I think is the main risk that comes out of biasing in healthcare. The other one, of course, is kind of propagating biases because the systems that are in use kind of amplify them. So instead of trying to track back and find the biases and try to correct them, the systems, by being employed and being in use, just basically push them forward, and people take them as being part of reality, right? So these are from my point of view, these are the two main, dangers there.
Tawfiq, really quick, one of the when you were giving your presentation, you had mentioned some research and also a book at the beginning of your introduction. Could you repeat that researcher's name, please?
Sure. Yeah, I'll write it in the
chat.
It's Kentaro Toyama, and the book is Geek Heresy. yeah, I've just
Great.
included them in the chat.
Thanks. Sorry. Caitlin?
Yeah, sure. So kind of going back to wondering about some of the negative impacts, maybe. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is when we prioritize things, we by necessity deprioritize other things, right? And so by prioritizing things like efficiency, I do wonder, by prioritizing. So for example, if we are doing digital phenotyping, which I'll define really briefly here. So when we say digital phenotyping, we're talking about using people's digital trace data, right? So either things they post on social media, maybe even the searches that they're doing and the websites that they're visiting, their mobile phone interactions, right? So not necessarily the content of their text messages, but how many they send and to how many people they interact with, right? We can use all of this data to build predictive models of behavior, right? So you might gather all of this digital data about someone and then have them fill out a bunch of surveys, right, that are validated survey instruments that will then assess their mental health status, right? And so we can then build predictive digital phenotyping models, right, where we can use, this kind of trace data, right, or metadata, yes, exactly, right, to build, a predictive model of how people might be feeling or behaving, at least in the mental health space, right? And so when we're doing this, we're prioritizing this idea that people who have a mental health condition might not want to go to their doctor about it for a variety of reasons, right? And so we might want to intervene, right, especially in a crisis situation, right? So if someone's at high risk for suicide, right, in the here and now, right, we want to intervene now, right? We can't wait until they happen to go to the doctor, right, because it's a risk right now. And so thinking about prioritizing these individual risk assessments rather than thinking about the larger risk of conducting surveillance on wide swaths of society, right? So surveillance technologies often harm populations of people who are otherwise marginalized, right? They cause greater harm to people who are marginalized. So this is a much larger risk, but it's much more invisible than the risk, right, that that this particular type of digital phenotyping is trying to respond to, right, or an individual person's risk of harm to self or risk of suicide, right? And so these are two very different kinds of risks, and we're prioritizing one and deprioritizing the other. And so that's one of the things I really worry about, right, is this encroachment of surveillance on daily life. Do we have time to chat a little bit more? Tafiq, maybe Charles, or Vivek, do people have anything to add about some of these risks or maybe negative impacts of AI in healthcare?
I'll add, I guess I'll just echo what Tawfiq was saying. The idea is that of amplification. So you amplify the good and you can amplify the bad. And many times people don't even realize what they are amplifying. And that's the thing which does worry me, right? That people don't even realize that just because this is what the data set looked like in the past, I will amplify it. Hence, I'll be making those biases become 100 times more potent. That's not something which everybody realizes. And that's what worries me. Another thing which worries me is, again, all people are biased, all data are biased. There's no denying that. Another one thing which is happening increasingly with these algorithmic mediation is there are very few people often sitting in the Silicon Valley or certain places on planet Earth which look similar in certain ways. They can now impact lives of billions of people rather than lives of dozens of people. So this, again, this concentration of power is another issue which, again, can lead to some negative things if people are not careful.
I think sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
think that's just one thing that kind of is difficult to, fairness is a very difficult thing to actually articulate or define in the first place. And if you're trying to hand over the definition of fairness to the builders of the algorithms, that's compounding the problem in the sense that they don't even have the training to see when there is clear unfairness in the system. So I think it's both the biases, but just like, I don't know that there is a good definition of fairness out there, right? There are some things that we all can identify as unfair, but defining what the system can do to make things fairer as opposed to push things in the wrong direction is a bit more difficult to do. So as we're like, I think one of the problems that comes up is in introductory courses that teach computer science or data science, questions about ethics of applying these technologies are kind of either not broached or just basically an addendum to the training, right? It's not brought up like, if the metrics of your system are in such a way that you are penalizing a minority of the data, what does that mean, right? Because sometimes it doesn't mean much, sometimes, not in healthcare, but there are areas where it's like we accept that. But in other areas, we don't, because like if it's healthcare and you have a smaller minority and your system will kind of penalize them in the sense that they don't get the services that they need, then that's a big problem.
Absolutely. And I guess that leads us really nicely into the last question I want us to try to tackle before we get into the Q&A. And please add some questions that you have from the audience in the chat. I've got a couple lined up here for us to chat about. But I guess I'm wondering, what do we do, right, about this? Are there ways to avoid algorithmic bias in healthcare or ways to mitigate it, maybe?
I'll take a step. I think there are multiple ways. None of them is there's no magic wand, right? But that doesn't mean that we should stop trying or stop working in this space. There are multiple layers to it. You could think of it as a social process. You could think of this as a legal process, and you could think of it as a technical process. And I think the reality is an intersection of these and many other things. Right. So again, doesn't mean that we shouldn't do any of these. We should just acknowledge that there is effort needed on all or many of these fronts. Right. I'll talk a bit more on maybe the technical side. That's where I guess I engage most with. So there are ways to audit. There are systematic ways increasingly being developed. There are ways to kind of give data sheets equivalent of like, a machine, and it came with specifications. Product specifications, same thing people are coming up with for data, same kind of things people are trying to come up with for algorithms. There are also ways to do black box testing, which is you give an input, you see the output, you are trying to infer what's happening inside based on the input and the output. There are also ways to do white box testing, which is that you go inside the nitty-gritty and try to tweak things inside that and see what changes can be done. And sometimes the differences are very obvious. Like if you were using, I don't know, zip code as one of your predictors, then it's very obvious. But some other times it's not, it's hidden in 3 layers of convolutional neural networks, and you might miss it in the first instance, right? But there are ways to kind of tweak, audit the process versus audit the outcome, audit the data going into the system, post-process the data or the results coming out of the system. The good news is there is a lot of work going on in each of these spaces. The bad news is often people understand one, and then they would not know, or they won't have enough of experience with like the socio-technical system of it or the legal aspects of it. And each one of us often works in a silo. I wish we could like try to do something to connect those dots better.
Well, and I actually think one of the reasons it's difficult is that a lot of people's perspectives come from a totally different way of defining what we mean by science, to go back to what Charles was saying about objectivity, right, and neutrality in science. So if we have different versions of reality that we're working with in our science, it's difficult, right, to crosswalk between those things. And I really like what you said earlier, Vivek, about this kind of concentration of power, to get back to thinking about, I think one of the ways to mitigate some of these biases is, right, a lot of this work comes from researchers who are situated in what we call weird countries, right? And so weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And a lot of the research is coming out of places that have a very specific, right, perspective on some of these questions. And so integrating more perspectives, I think, is one way to push against bias. We're also having a lovely discussion in the chat here about the differences between equity, equality, and fairness. Charles dropped a great link there. So I think we might, unless we have some other thoughts about ways to avoid bias, I think we've got a couple of nice questions from the chat that I'd love to bring up here in our last few minutes.
I have one here. So Matthew asked, what are your thoughts about the use of algorithms and big data in assisting healthcare professionals in diagnosis and treatment on an individual scale? What are the ethical issues that algorithmic bias introduce to the use of such data in practice? So I think we've kind of covered that a little, right?
I think a little. I think it has to do with maybe some of those questions about risk that I was asking earlier, right? So are we talking about the risk to the individual, right? And if we prioritize that over the risk to, right, the social fabric at large, right, in terms of thinking about surveillance here. Do other people have thoughts?
I guess this is not necessarily about the algorithms, but I wonder like how the data is used and how it's, you know, reused by other algorithms and how it can be incorporated into other algorithms. That's the one concern, I guess I have.
Okay, we had another question from Evan. Evan asks, this is a tough one. How do you account for the fact or quantify that often those most in need of help are often the least able to seek it out?
That's a really good question. And I think that that is kind of one of the core logics of something like digital phenotyping for mental health. I don't know, what do other people think? Do other people have ideas about that? I mean, one of the things that makes me think of is, you know, and this goes back to what Vivek was saying earlier. We have this legal layer, a social layer, a technical layer, right? This is actually a socio-technical problem. And so it's both social and technical. So the solution needs to be a social and a technical solution and not just a technical solution, right? So the fact that people who most need help, at least in the mental health care sector, are the least likely to be able to seek it out, right? Some of that is a social problem and needs to be solved with social solutions, right? Rather than maybe necessarily solved just from the technical side of things. Do other people have thoughts about that?
No, I completely agree though. Yes, that also, yeah, the previous question was also very pertinent and not an easy one to respond to, right? Yes, like with real world, the same thing applies for these technology mediated healthcare solutions. The people who need it most are often the least represented, the least able to access these solutions. Yeah, the problems tend to be compounded for those folks. And I guess we can think of those folks early on in the design process, and that's at least one step towards it. But yeah, we might need social, cultural, familial, all kinds of support mechanisms to counter that problem. There's no, I mean, nothing even comes close to being a useful answer to something like that.
Okay, so I've got a great question from Michelle Novak, but it's long, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, and we only have a couple of minutes to actually deal with it before we go to closing comments. But long story short, the New York Times had an article that summarized the headline, "What happens when people stop going to the doctor? We're about to find out." And Michelle wants to know, is there a way to actually use AI to create a second normalized set of data to correct for COVID skew? Because we're going to have, again, a huge disruption in people's normal medical care and data that's caused by COVID. Is that going to mess up algorithmic development? That's kind of the question, right?
I mean, I certainly see it causing issues in some of this digital phenotyping. I don't know what you think maybe about that, Vivek, right? But if you're using people's trace data on their phones, right, and maybe even like doing something like geolocation data, right? Like, I don't know about y'all, but the number of places I went to dramatically changed in 2020, and it doesn't look like it's going to change again anytime soon, but it will, right? And so, you know, if we were using a predictive model to figure out whether or not I was isolating myself and I was in a mental health crisis, right? So data changes over time, and the meaning of that data changes over time, which is very challenging. I don't know. Do other people have thoughts about this?
I completely agree. I mean, any good scientist always describes their bench, that these were the conditions under which we collected these data. And anybody who is trying to do science with these kinds of data like 2020, 2021, they need to explain the context in which these data were collected. If that doesn't hold true, then our interpretations will not be useful or relevant. So yes, I just want to point out again, maybe, I mean, COVID has not been good for practically anybody, but one silver lining has been, it has allowed for a natural experiment for things. And like, I guess that's what I'm reading the tone of that headline to be, that what would happen if people don't go to a regular doctor. So this is like, in a way, a natural experiment for that. And well, you know, just trying to think of it as an opportunity to do a before after analysis or a comparative analysis could also be interesting. But again, I need to read this more and understand what exactly is covered in that article.
So as much as I think we all have more that we want to say, I think it might be time to move to our closing remarks. Connie?
Yes, so I'd like to go around to each of the panelists and get your 15 to 30-second soundbite for what does every information professional really need to know about AI and bias in healthcare. And then we will wrap it up with Marie Radford. Tawfiq, do you want to go ahead and start? Close this out?
Sure. I think one thing people should know is a little bit more about algorithms and how they're actually built. So I think you need to have some technical chops in understanding, you know, how metrics are scored, so that you can actually have a more nuanced conversation with more technical counterparts.
Fantastic. Charles, you're up. What's your 30 seconds?
I would just reiterate that the machines like we are not objective or bias free. So just keep in mind that to look for the bias, because it's there, and if it's not apparent, look further, because finding the bias is the first step in mitigating its negative effects.
Wonderful. Vivek.
I would just caution, I would say we all need to be cautiously optimistic about things. We thought AI will solve all the problems, and that was wrong. And then we might be believing that AI is all terrible, and that's also not correct. The reality lies somewhere in the middle, and we need to embrace that.
Wonderful. And Caitlin, will you wrap us up before we go to Marie?
Sure. I think actually what I'd like to say is that the idea of cautious optimism is really important. And just like Tawfiq was saying, knowing how algorithms are created is a really important piece of the puzzle, but also understanding the social context is something that I want to also stress. So this is socio-technical, and it's a moving target.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, panel. Marie, would you like to kind of give us your closing thoughts and remarks about this incredibly important, timely, cautiously optimistic, and frightening topic all at the same time?
Thank you, Connie. So my big wish is that we had more time. And I want to say, you know, commend all the panelists, very exciting work. It's wonderful to hear about what you're all been up to, what you're doing. This is such a vital part of what we need to do to understand, to be, you know, informed consumers as well as participants in this process. We're all data creators these days, and, you know, our data traces are following us around everywhere. So I think this idea of finding the bias is really important, and obviously understanding how this all works, which is all the work that you're all doing to try to figure out how to understand it and to educate people. You know, especially, you know, some of the work like Charles is doing and others, that to educate people as well, to make them more aware, to make them better able to kind of represent themselves. I also want to commend all of the students and all the audience. What a great conversation has been going on also in chat. Lots of good resources that were pushed. I always try to cut and paste those links before the chat goes away. And thank you, Connie, as our host. I would just say next time, let's have longer. Let's have a panel that can be a little bit longer, because it looks like, I feel like we kind of had just drive-by, kind of everybody was talking really rapidly. We heard a lot of great information, really every single one of these areas we could dig deeper into. So really appreciate this today. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for being out there investigating on this really new frontier.
Yeah, it's amazing. Really loved hearing what the faculty members and your research projects are all about. So with that, we are right at 1 o'clock. So for those of you who have to dive off and leave, thank you for attending. As Marie mentioned, we look forward to seeing your reflections written up in the Colloquium course. And with that, we'll say goodbye to you. But our panel has graciously agreed to stay on for a few minutes afterwards to continue the more informal Q&A. So with that, goodbye and welcome to the informal Q&A. So I'll start with the panel. Anything surprise you about what your other panelists said, or were you at all inspired by any of those?
I guess the phenotyping issue that Caitlin brought up was new to me.
That was brand new to me too.
I don't remember who coined that term. It's out there in the universe. But we wrote an ACIST paper about this study where we talked about digital phenotyping pretty extensively. One of the things I wish I had said and I didn't say was that just because these technologies exist doesn't mean that they always have to exist. So if we figure out that they're not working for us, we don't have to keep making them.
Josh, nice to see you, Josh Rochette. You've been listening very carefully all hour long, and I know you well, so you must have a few questions. What's on your mind?
I do, and I feel like an outsider here, so I haven't added anything because I wanted the students definitely to get what they needed there. So I know Caitlin, Charles, Vivek, I've been a student of yours at one time or another and walked the halls, but now I actually work at a company working to define AI models for detecting risk and quality management in studies in clinical research. And I'm interested to understand, what is the responsibility of scientists to potentially delay research findings in order to have a more fair and equitable, sample size of data and sample size time to develop better algorithms in terms of these, time to save research projects? COVID is extremely important. We got things out really quickly, but was quick the correct way, and what ways could we make it better so that we don't delay on years trying to find the right way to make things balanced?
Ooh, good question.
I'm a little nervous at the notion of delaying, because it's like, delay until what?
Until you have a bigger sample size, or the sample size is going to not to better reflect the population.
Or to have dealt with the bias. We
wouldn't have cancer drugs then.
True. So what responsibility do we have in moving fast and not well identifying the bias and controlling for it? And what time do we have to spare to mitigate that while we're researching?
I learned early in my PhD experience that all studies have limitations. And I think if we paid more attention to them, I think that they're not bad. When I first learned that, I was like, oh my gosh, how do I do a study? But then you realize that the more open and the more descriptive you are with your limitations, it actually shows that you've thought through some of the unanticipated consequences, so to speak. So I don't know. I think that I get a little hesitant when I say we the notion that we shouldn't report. I think that we should report what we know and what we don't know, and report limitations. But I'd invite alternative points of view on that.
Actually, I'll second Charles, and I'll add this, that not all studies are n equal to large, and not all studies are representative. There are lots of n equal to 1 studies. There are also detailed, in medical journals, you'll see case study, a single case, and they describe that, and that's also helpful. There are also focus groups and interviews and in-depth understanding of one person, a few people, an exploratory study, which is not supposed to be representative. There are also, randomized control trials. There's also systematic literature reviews. So there's no one monolith of what scientific experiments or research is. And we need a little bit of all of these. You wouldn't want to probably run a national representative scale study until you've done some exploratory analysis anyways. So there are multiple phases, stages, and reasons to do all of these, which brings back eventually to what Charles was saying. It's important to note what we can and cannot infer out of what we have studied.
And to add to that, I mean, I think one of the real problems here is that we don't fund basic science very much anymore, right? In the United States, like the funding for the way that we think about science, especially funding agencies, is translational work, right? So like, can I create a thing, right, that will have immediate public impact, right? And there's obviously we need translational science, right? But we also need basic science. And so like Vivek's saying, understanding things like the underlying causes, conditions, and consequences of, particular technologies is really, really important. And that's ongoing work, right? Like we can't just develop a model and then it lives in stasis, right? Because things change over time. So one thing I would say is, right, funding more basic science to understand some of these social processes that are underlying what's happening is really an important piece of the puzzle.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Again, folks, you can take yourselves off mute. We're having just a conversation. Feel free to jump in and ask a question.
We talked a little bit about like AI and bullying. What about AI that causes bullying, like on Twitter? How do we combat that?
Could you unpack that a bit? What does AI?
Like bots. They literally, people have Twitter feeds, and then they'll design like 200 racist bots to just, I guess, attack someone socially on a variety of different platforms. How do we combat that?
Again, like many of the other things that we've discussed earlier, right? There has to be a social solution to this. It's people designing this for some socially relevant reasons, good and bad. There's the technical solution. So there are multiple companies, multiple research papers trying to devise newer algorithms which can automatically detect bots and weed them out, and especially negative content kind of bots, and that needs to be done. And then there is at least the legal side of it. So again, it's a combination of all these and more that is needed.
The question is, this is a great question. I love this question. It's making me think of the Microsoft chatbot. Do people remember that incident where Microsoft released a chatbot and allowed people to train it, and it
Within 24 hours, it was spewing racist and homophobic and misogynistic.
It was within hours.
It was crazy. Yeah.
It didn't take long at all.
No, I was teaching a class the day that it came out. And in the morning, I was like, oh, I'll mention this in class. And by the time class came around, I was like, it's gone already, right? They had removed it from the internet. And so one of the things that I think this case actually demonstrates, right, is that, again, sometimes we can dismantle or remove technologies if they're not doing what we want them to, right? And so what Microsoft did was just pull Tay off of the internet completely, which is, dismantling things is a valid strategy for some stuff.
There was a question earlier in the chat about, is there an AI code of ethics?
That was me.
Yeah, right.
Is that a UN document, by the way? Or? I was just curious.
I shared one link, but there are multiple ones. One from ACM, Association for Computing Machinery. Again, if I spend 10 more minutes with Google, I think I can point you to a better link. But this was just to say that, yes, there are multiple such options. Again, options in the sense there's no one definitive version of it.
I mean, it's like the media code of ethics. It's going to be out there, but it's whether
Mhm.
people want to use it or not.
Well, my concern, of course, is in computer science programs, are they teaching does a computer science program even are they going and discussing bias and coding and all that's happened, or are they really just focused on the dynamics of programming? I mean, because that's part and parcel where the issues come from in AI algorithmic bias. They're coded into the system.
So can I just use that as a prompt to talk about a couple of initiatives going on at Rutgers?
Yeah.
So one of them is that there's this interdisciplinary data science program, which will start off as a certificate, go on to a minor, and eventually a major. It's a joint effort between multiple departments in SAS. So com science is one of them, but also stats, also math, also economics, also a bunch of other places, and our school, so School of Communication and Information. So what we, and I happen to be part of that committee, what we have actively been arguing for is the need for classes like data in context, ethics of AI to be core essential requirements, and also infusing all the other classes, which are classes on building machine learning models, classes on doing data wrangling, to have a component which talks about these things. So as you said, right, not everybody got the benefit of that training, and they may not even realize what they are amplifying. So that doing that kind of an awareness and making that part of the curriculum going forward is extremely important. Also, there's this critical AI initiative, which is again across multiple departments. They had Meredith Whittaker, I think, as the keynote speaker. Safia Noble is going to be there as one of the panelists coming up soon. So again, they're organizing, and that one actually, well, I think that the person who started it or was leading it is from the English language department. So it's again, very, very interdisciplinary, but again, has people from our school, has people from CS and stats and so on as well. There's also at least one NRT, which is like a relatively large training grant between multiple departments, and that is for socially cognizant robots. And it actually comes, or the lead person is from ECE, Electrical and Computer Engineering. So as I said, I'm using that prompt to talk about that, yes, computer scientists, electrical and computer engineering, or just broadly, the entire campus is waking up to it. There are more efforts to make this part and parcel of all the regular classes. But again, it's a start. It's just a start.
And I'll put in a shameless plug. We have an Algorithms in Society class here in the MI that Dr. Britt Paris is teaching. I believe she's teaching it next fall. She's also teaching it now, and I've taught it a few times in the past. My syllabus is floating around on the internet somewhere, and I'm happy to provide it. I can also throw a link in the chat to it at some point. But so we, if you are in the MI program, there's opportunities for you to take coursework directly about how algorithms and society work together and impact one another.
Okay, we're at 1:11 or so. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll let everybody head off for the day. Anybody else got anything they'd like to discuss? No, Matthew, you've been I caught your attention. Do you have a question or anything that you'd like to talk about?
I was stewing on a question, but it was more of like, how do you think we should work to inform people about this issue, like not just people who are professionals and actually have to like encounter it, but like the larger public? Or I was thinking about it more from a healthcare bias also, like how do you inform patients that they might be like susceptible to algorithmic bias? I don't know if I said that right.
Wow, that's a tough one. Caitlin, that sounds like one for you.
That is such a good question. I mean, I think, one of the things that I really appreciate, like about Charles's work specifically, and I know Dr. Paris does this, or Britt does this too, right, is working really closely with communities, right, and with people, right? And so as researchers, we have a responsibility maybe, right, to figure out how to translate our science, right, to the general public, right? And so maybe Charles, you can speak on that a little bit more, but this is a really big issue in the news a lot. So, you know, there's an avenue there maybe, but.
I guess piggybacking on what Caitlin said, yeah, depending on the application, it's tough to speak in general terms here, but I find that engaging with people who are part of or closer to the people who will be affected or using whatever it is that you're studying or developing is just generally a good practice. It's messier, it takes longer, it's probably more expensive, but in the end, you come up with insights that you wouldn't have had before. And frankly, I think it's better science because of that. So it's a price to pay to sort of, instead of having your own sort of insular team develop something to reach out beyond your own discipline, beyond your own group, and get input. It's not easy, but the insights are worth it overall, as I think about it. So to Caitlin's point, if you're thinking about an app for diabetics to learn about insulin, then if you're doing that in an environment where there isn't a diabetic who's used insulin, then that's probably where the problem
Doing
starts.
it wrong.
You're not doing it right, exactly.
Yeah.
So not to say that finding that person and having them there is a panacea, but I think that you'll find that habit sort of replicates itself because you see, oh my goodness.
But isn't that also true about even helping to develop your research question? You know, go out and talk to
Oh,
people.
Sure, upstream from that.
Discover, you know, what's out there. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and make the command decision to wrap up our colloquium for this evening, for this afternoon. So once again, panel, thank you all. Students, thank you all for joining, and there will be a video of this later. And this has been really, really good. It always makes me a little nervous to think about the whole algorithmic impact, or the impact of algorithms in our lives, because it's definitely impactful. I guess that's with that. So, all right, with that, everybody, thank you, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great job, Caitlin.
Thank you, Connie. This was really wonderful. Thanks.
Did a really good job. Sorry, my thanks, Vivek. You did really great too.
No, and I want to just thank you both. Yes. Bye-bye.
Excellent stuff.
Bye.
You guys, wait, you had a paper.
Oh, yeah, I can ask them. It's not a published paper.
That's why.
So I don't know if we want to send it out, because I think that
Okay.
we're all trying to scavenge it. Maybe, you know,
Okay.
pieces of it in other work because it's not published.
Got it. Okay.
But I'm happy to send, like, you might want to ask everyone if they have a paper of their own that they want to send, because I have an ACES paper about
Yeah,
all this.
I'll send out a note to the panelists, and then I'll post the papers when I do the video. So
Okay.
cool. All right. Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.